The cold seeped through Leo's thin jeans, a damp chill that felt more invasive than the autumn air. It was the cold of the cracked asphalt, a cold he knew intimately. His books, splayed around him like fallen soldiers, had their pages ruffled by a mocking wind. Above him, a circle of faces blurred into a single, sneering entity. The laughter was the worst part. It wasn't the boisterous, joyful sound of a shared joke. It was sharp and cruel. A series of percussive jabs aimed directly at the twisted metal brace on his right leg. The brace, usually a source of quiet stability, was now the focal point of his humiliation, its polished steel catching the flat, gray light of the sky. Kyle, the ringleader, stood with his feet planted wide, a caricature of adolescent power. He nudged one of Leo's textbooks with the toe of his expensive sneaker. "Look at him," Kyle announced to his audience, his voice dripping with condescending glee. He fell over. Again. It's like his legs are just for decoration. The laughter intensified. A wave of sound that washed over Leo, threatening to drown him. He didn't look up. He focused on a single, dark pebble embedded in the asphalt, making its rough texture the center of his universe. If he could just concentrate on that, on the solid, unfeeling stone, maybe he could ignore the sting behind his eyes. Other students skirted the scene, their gazes flicking towards the spectacle before quickly looking away. Their silence was a form of complicity, a quiet agreement that what was happening was acceptable, or at least not worth their intervention. They had places to be, friends to meet, lives that didn't involve a boy with a useless leg lying on the ground. Leo began the painstaking process of gathering his belongings. Each movement was deliberate, a small act of defiance against the paralysis of shame. His fingers, numb with cold, fumbled with the smooth cover of his history book. As he reached for it, Kyle's sneaker shot out, sending the book skittering across the pavement, its spine cracking as it hit the curb. "Oops," Kyle said, the feigned apology hanging in the air like poison. Leo didn't respond. He just breathed, in out, a slow, steady rhythm his father had taught him. "Control your breath," his dad used to say, his own hands stained with engine grease. "And you control the world inside you. The world outside can't touch that," but the world outside was touching it now, pressing in on him with the weight of its judgment and indifference. He felt like a specimen under a microscope, his weakness magnified for all to see. This wasn't a rare occurrence. It was a ritual, a daily reminder of his otherness, served up by Kyle and his disciples for the entertainment of the apathetic. And every day, Leo endured it, his dignity a flickering candle he desperately tried to shield from the relentless wind of their cruelty. He finally managed to pull his scattered books into a pile, his arms trembling from the strain. He used the nearby wall to slowly, painstakingly, pull himself up. The brace on his leg felt heavy, a dead weight anchoring him to this moment of degradation. He stood, finally, facing his tormentors, his expression a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. He would not give them the satisfaction of his tears. He would not give them his anger. He would give them nothing. He simply stood, a frail but unbroken figure against the backdrop of a cold, uncaring schoolyard. The conflict was a slow-burning fire, one that had been stoked for months. It wasn't about a single incident. It was a campaign of attrition designed to erode Leo's very sense of self. Kyle, with his easy athleticism and casual cruelty, had identified Leo as the perfect target. The leg brace was a visible symbol of vulnerability, an invitation to a bully who thrived on the imbalance of power. Today's performance in the schoolyard was merely the latest act in a long and miserable play. Kyle swaggered closer, his cronies, Mark and Josh, flanking him like poorly trained guard dogs. "What's the matter, Leo? Cat got your tongue?" Kyle taunted, his face inches from Leo's. Leo could smell the cloying sweetness of the energy drink on Kyle's breath. He remained silent, his gaze fixed on a point just over Kyle's shoulder, a brick in the school wall that had a small, defiant patch of moss growing from its mortar. He focused on the tenacity of that moss, clinging to life in a barren landscape. "I'm talking to you, cripple," Kyle spat, the word landing with physical force. He shoved Leo's shoulder, a jarring impact that sent a tremor through his body. Leo stumbled, his braced legs struggling to find purchase. He righted himself, the effort costing him a sharp intake of breath. The denial of his worth was systemic. It wasn't just Kyle. It was in the teachers who saw the shoves in the hallway and chose to interpret them as boys being boys. It was in the averted eyes of Mrs. Davison, the English teacher, when Kyle would loudly mock Leo's slow, careful walk to the front of the classroom. It was in the principal, Mr. Albright, a man whose spine seemed to be made of gelatin. He'd had Kyle in his office a half-dozen times, delivering tired, scripted lectures about respect and school policy, each word dissolving into meaninglessness before it even left his mouth. Kyle would emerge from these meetings with a smirk, emboldened by the sheer inefficacy of the authority meant to constrain him. The institution itself was a silent partner in his humiliation. It chose the path of least resistance, and that path ran directly over Leo. "Leave him alone, Kyle," a small voice piped up. It was Sarah, a girl from his science class. She stood a few feet away, her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. Kyle turned his head slowly, a predator noticing an unexpected noise. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. Sarah flinched but held her ground. "I said, leave him alone," Kyle laughed. A short, ugly bark. "Go play with your dolls, Sarah." "The men are talking," he turned back to Leo, his amusement fading, replaced by a cold fury. He hated being challenged, especially by a girl, and especially in defense of someone like Leo. He saw Leo's quiet endurance not as strength, but as weakness, a silent judgment on his own loud, empty bravado. He needed to break it. He needed to see Leo cry or rage or beg. He needed a reaction to validate his power. He snatched Leo's backpack, unzipped it, and unceremoniously dumped its contents onto the damp ground. Pens, a half-eaten apple, a carefully folded drawing, and a small, worn leather wallet tumbled out. Kyle bent down and picked up the wallet. "What have we got here? Lunch money?" he sneered, flipping it open. Leo's quiet strength was not born of nothingness. It was forged in the crucible of loss and love. His memories of his father were fragmented but vivid, like powerful, sun-bleached photographs. He remembered the smell of motor oil and sawdust that always clung to his father's clothes, a scent he associated with safety and warmth. He remembered massive, calloused hands, surprisingly gentle as they helped him adjust the prototype brace his father had engineered in their garage. His dad, Marcus, had been a mechanic, but he was an artist with metal, a wizard with an engine. He saw the world not as it was, but as it could be, a series of problems waiting for an elegant solution. The accident had been a blur of screeching tires, shattering glass, and a sudden, violent silence. A drunk driver had crossed the center line on a rain-slicked night. Marcus had swerved, his final act a desperate, instinctive attempt to shield the passenger side, where a 7-year-old Leo was sitting. Marcus was killed instantly. Leo survived, but his right leg was crushed, a permanent, painful reminder of the moment his world shattered. The brace he wore now was a professional, medical-grade device, but in his heart, he still felt the phantom weight of his father's handcrafted original, a testament to a love that could bend steel. His mother, Elena, was a different kind of strong. Where Marcus had been a booming, laughing presence, Elena was a quiet, relentless force. She worked 2 jobs, one as a waitress at a greasy spoon diner and another cleaning offices late at night. Leo saw the exhaustion etched into the lines around her eyes, the way her shoulders slumped when she thought he wasn't looking. He knew she skipped meals so he could have new shoes, that she stitched the worn cuffs of his shirts with thread that almost matched. Her love wasn't in grand pronouncements. It was in the 1,000 tiny sacrifices she made every day. She never complained. She just endured, her focus singular, giving Leo a life his father would have been proud of. This was the legacy Leo carried. His father's principle of inner strength and his mother's example of quiet resilience. He had learned from them that true character wasn't about the absence of hardship, but about how one faced it. When Kyle and his friends mocked his limp, they were mocking the echo of his father's final, protective act. When they tried to humiliate him, they were chipping away at the foundation his mother worked herself to the bone to build. He didn't fight back with fists because his father had taught him that violence was the language of those who had run out of ideas. He didn't crumble because he knew his tears would add another unbearable weight to his mother's already heavy burden. So he absorbed the taunts, the shoves, the isolation. He treated it like a storm to be weathered, a force of nature that could be endured but not reasoned with. Inside, he cultivated a quiet space, a fortress built from his father's words and his mother's love. It was in this inner sanctum that he held onto his dignity. He knew who he was. He was the son of Marcus, the man who could fix anything. He was the son of Elena, the woman who could carry everything. His leg might be broken, but his spirit was forged from something far stronger than bone. The pressure intensified over the next few weeks, becoming a suffocating, ambient presence in Leo's life. The incident in the schoolyard had emboldened Kyle. Sarah's brief intervention had been a spark of defiance, but it was quickly snuffed out by the overwhelming apathy of the student body. Kyle, angered by the challenge to his authority, doubled down on his torment. It was no longer confined to the physical spaces of the school. It bled into the digital world, a place where cruelty could be amplified and anonymized. A video appeared online. Someone, likely Mark or Josh, had filmed Leo falling that day. The footage was grainy and shaky, but it was unmistakably him. Kyle, with a level of malicious creativity, had edited it. He'd added a clumsy, repetitive soundtrack of a clown horn and a slide whistle. He'd looped the fall over and over, then interspersed it with clips of stumbling robots and collapsing buildings. The video was titled Leo the Broken Toy, and it spread through the school's social networks like a virus. Leo's phone buzzed with notifications, each one a fresh sting. He saw the view count climb into the hundreds. He read the comments, a torrent of laughing emojis and casual insults from people he barely knew. The humiliation was no longer a public spectacle. It was a private one he carried in his pocket, a constant, vibrating reminder of his perceived weakness. At school, the whispers followed him down the hallways. He'd hear the faint sound of a slide whistle being mimicked as he passed. People who had once been indifferent now looked at him with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. He felt his world shrinking, the walls closing in. The silence from the adults remained deafening. Mr. Henderson, his history teacher, a man whose lectures on civil rights and standing up to injustice were famously passionate, seemed to develop a sudden fascination with the ceiling tiles whenever Leo was being targeted just outside his classroom door. He would clear his throat, adjust his tie, and wait for the commotion to pass, his inaction a betrayal of every principle he purported to teach. Leo felt utterly alone, an island in a sea of silent observers. He would sit in the library during lunch, finding solace in the quiet company of books, but even there he wasn't safe. He'd see them, the smirking faces peering at him from behind bookshelves, phones held up to capture another photo for their amusement. The crisis was escalating towards a breaking point. It was a war of nerves, and Leo was hopelessly outgunned. Yet he refused to break. Each morning, he would carefully strap on his brace, the familiar clicks of the buckles a small ritual of preparation for the day's battle. He would meet his mother's worried gaze with a small, reassuring smile, a lie that cost him more energy than walking a mile. He kept his grades up. He handed his assignments in on time. He participated in class when called upon, his voice steady even as his heart hammered against his ribs. He was holding onto the structure of a normal life with white-knuckled determination, refusing to let them dismantle him piece by piece. His endurance was a quiet, desperate scream into a void that refused to answer back. The annual school charity drive was in full swing, a week-long event filled with bake sales, car washes, and donation jars in every classroom. This year, the funds were being raised for the local children's hospital, a cause that resonated deeply with Leo. He remembered the long, sterile hallways, the smell of antiseptic, and the kindness of the nurses who had cared for him after the accident. The centerpiece of the final day was a school-wide assembly, where the final fundraising totals would be announced. A large glass jar was placed on a table at the front of the auditorium, a final chance for students to contribute. As students filed in, Kyle and his crew made a show of their own contribution. Kyle swaggered up to the jar, holding a crisp $50 bill. He waved it around for everyone to see before dramatically stuffing it into the slot. "Just doing my part to help the less fortunate," he announced loudly, casting a pointed look in Leo's direction. The implication was clear, and a few of his friends snickered appreciatively. Leo sat near the back, trying to be invisible. In his pocket, his fingers traced the edges of a worn, folded $20 bill. It was all he had. It was the money his mother had given him for the week's lunches, a significant sacrifice from her meager budget. He had been stretching it, eating half a sandwich and saving the rest, making it last. He had planned to put it in the jar, but now, after Kyle's ostentatious display, the gesture felt small, insignificant. He felt a hot flush of shame. The assembly dragged on, a series of boring speeches and awkward student performances. Suddenly, a commotion erupted near the back of the auditorium. A younger student, a freshman named Timmy who was known for being anxious and easily flustered, was having some kind of medical emergency. He was gasping for air, his face turning a pale, bluish color. He was choking. Panic rippled through the student body. Teachers started shouting instructions. Someone ran to call the nurse. But in the chaos, no one was actually doing anything. Timmy stumbled, clutching his throat, his eyes wide with terror. Kyle and his friends were nearby. They just stood there, frozen, their expressions a mixture of shock and morbid fascination. They were spectators, just as they always were. But Leo moved. It wasn't a thought, it was an instinct. He pushed himself up, his braced leg a clumsy anchor, and moved towards the struggling boy. He was slow, his gait uneven, but he was the only one moving in the right direction. He reached Timmy, who was now starting to slump to the floor. Leo knew he wasn't strong enough to perform the Heimlich maneuver properly. He looked around wildly, his eyes landing on a teacher, Mr. Henderson, who was standing frozen against the wall, his face ashen. "Help him!" Leo yelled, his voice cracking with urgency. But he didn't wait. He dropped to his knees behind Timmy, ignoring the sharp pain as his bad leg bent at an awkward angle. He wrapped his arms around the smaller boy's waist as best he could. "Lean forward," he commanded, his voice surprisingly firm. He made a fist and placed it just above Timmy's navel, then used his other hand to drive it inward and upward with a sharp thrust. It was a weak, poorly executed attempt, but he did it again, and then again, pouring every ounce of his limited strength into the effort. On the third thrust, a small piece of hard candy shot out of Timmy's mouth, skittering across the polished floor. Timmy collapsed against him, taking huge, shuddering gulps of air. The entire auditorium was silent, the only sound the boy's ragged breaths and Leo's own heavy panting. He had acted. While everyone else watched, he had acted. He stayed on the floor, holding the trembling boy, his own leg throbbing with a dull, insistent pain, completely unaware that the world around him had fundamentally shifted. The silence in the auditorium was absolute, a thick, heavy blanket that had smothered the earlier panic. Every eye was on the two boys on the floor. Leo, still kneeling, was murmuring something reassuring to Timmy, his hand on the younger boy's back. The image was stark and powerful. The boy everyone called broken had been the only one whole enough to act. Mr. Henderson was the first to break the spell. He seemed to shake himself, as if waking from a trance. The color rushed back into his face, replaced by a deep, burning shame. He, the adult, the teacher, the one paid to be responsible for these children, had stood frozen against a wall. He had watched a boy choke and done nothing. And he had watched Leo, a student he had willfully ignored for months, a boy whose daily torment he had silently sanctioned, save the day. He strode forward, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous room. "Is he all right? Someone get the nurse down here now," he boomed, his voice full of a manufactured authority that felt hollow even to himself. He helped Timmy to his feet, but his eyes were on Leo. For the first time, he wasn't looking at the brace. He was looking at the boy. He saw the sweat on his brow, the grimace of pain from his twisted leg, and the unwavering resolve in his eyes. It was a look Mr. Henderson hadn't seen on a student in a very long time. It was the look of character. Whispers began to ripple through the student body, but they were different now. The mocking tones were gone, replaced by something else. Awe, confusion, and a dawning sense of collective guilt. Did you see that? He did it. Kyle was standing right there and didn't do a thing. Kyle, for his part, looked utterly bewildered. His currency was physical prowess and intimidation, both of which had been useless in this situation. He had been rendered irrelevant. Worse, he had been shown up by the very person he had built his reputation on tormenting. He saw the looks being sent his way, the subtle shift in the social calculus. His power was based on a perception of strength, and that perception had just been shattered. Leo, with the help of Mr. Henderson, slowly got to his feet. He brushed off his jeans and, without a word, started to limp back to his seat. The crowd of students parted for him, a silent, instinctive gesture of respect. As he passed the donation jar on the stage, he paused. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the crumpled $20 bill, and smoothed it out with his fingers. He then walked to the jar and pushed it through the slot. He didn't look at anyone. He didn't need their approval. The act was for himself, a quiet affirmation of his own values in a world that had tried so hard to make him forget them. He had saved a life and he had given all he had to give. Mr. Henderson watched him, a lump forming in his throat. He had failed this boy. They all had. He saw the video, the jeers, the isolation in a new, horrifying light. It wasn't just bullying. It was the persecution of someone whose quiet dignity was a mirror that reflected their own cowardice. The whispers continued, spreading from row to row. The story was already taking shape, becoming a legend in real time. The tide had not just turned. It had become a tsunami, and no one yet knew where the waters would settle. The final bell of the day shrieked through the school, a sound of release that, for once, felt charged with an unfamiliar tension. The events of the assembly had hung over the last few classes, a silent, shared knowledge that had reordered the school's social hierarchy. As students poured out of the main doors, blinking in the late afternoon sun, the usual chaotic chatter was subdued. Then they heard it. At first, it was a low, distant rumble, a vibration felt more in the chest than heard with the ears. It grew steadily, a deep, guttural growl that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. Conversations faltered. Students stopped in their tracks, their heads turning towards the main road. The rumble became a roar, the distinct, staggered thunder of multiple V-twin engines. One motorcycle, a massive, chrome-laden Harley-Davidson, turned into the school's long driveway. It was followed by another, and another, and another. They kept coming. A seemingly endless river of black leather, polished chrome, and denim flowed through the school gates. They were big men on big machines, their faces weathered and grim, their arms covered in intricate tattoos. On the back of their leather vests, their cuts, was the unmistakable, notorious insignia of the Hells Angels. The entire school population froze. Teachers who were on gate duty stopped mid-sentence, their mouths slightly agape. Students backed away from the driveway, a collective, instinctual retreat from a presence that radiated raw, untamed power. The bikers didn't park haphazardly. They arranged themselves with a kind of military precision, forming a perfect, intimidating semicircle around the main entrance, blocking all exits. Engines were cut one by one, the sudden silence punctuated by the metallic ticking of cooling engines. There had to be 80 of them. 80 silent, unsmiling men who now sat astride their machines, their collective gaze sweeping over the terrified faces of the students and staff. They were a wall of leather, steel, and unspoken menace. Kyle and his friends, who had been swaggering out of the school, ready to reclaim their narrative, stopped dead. The color drained from Kyle's face. This was a power he didn't understand and could never hope to match. This wasn't high school bravado. This was something real, something dangerous. The bikers just sat there, waiting. Their silence was more terrifying than any threat. It was the silence of predators who knew their prey was trapped. The air crackled with a palpable fear. No one moved. No one spoke. The entire school was held captive by the sheer, overwhelming presence of the brotherhood that had descended upon them. They were waiting for someone, and every single person there had a sickening feeling they knew who it was. The minutes stretched into an eternity, each second thick with dread. The bikers remained motionless, their eyes scanning the crowd, patient and watchful. They were a force of nature that had inexplicably been summoned to the manicured lawns of Northwood High, and the world would never be the same. Leo emerged from the school doors, his head down, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He was so lost in his own thoughts, replaying the day's events, that he didn't immediately notice the unnatural silence or the sea of motorcycles. He just wanted to get home, to the quiet safety of his small apartment. He took a few steps into the open, and then he looked up. He stopped, his breath catching in his throat. He saw them, all of them, and they were all looking at him. A path cleared through the students as if by an invisible force, leaving Leo standing alone, directly in the sights of 80 Hell's Angels. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through him. He thought they were there for him, that somehow his actions at the assembly had brought this terrifying new trouble to his doorstep. The leader, a man with a graying beard and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite, swung a leg off his bike. The leather of his chaps creaked as he stood. On his cut, the patch above the central logo read, Prez. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his boots heavy on the asphalt. He didn't walk towards Leo. Instead, he walked directly towards Mr. Henderson, who looked as if he might faint. The president stopped a foot away from the teacher, his shadow falling over him. "We heard there was a problem here," the president said. His voice was gravel, low and steady, but it carried across the silent yard with absolute authority. Mr. Henderson swallowed hard. I don't know what you're referring to," he stammered, his professional composure completely shattered. The president's eyes, hard as chips of flint, narrowed. "Don't lie to me. We hear everything. We heard a boy here, a good boy, is being treated like dirt. We heard the people in charge are letting it happen." His gaze flickered over to Leo, then back to the terrified teacher. Simultaneously, another biker, a mountain of a man with the name Roadblock, stitched on his vest, dismounted and walked towards Leo. He moved with surprising gentleness. He knelt, an act that seemed to require a significant effort, bringing his face level with Leo's. His beard was braided with small silver rings, and his eyes, unlike the president's, were surprisingly kind. "You're Marcus's boy, aren't you?" Roadblock asked, his voice a soft rumble. Leo stared, confused and scared. How did you know my dad?" Roadblock smiled, a rare and startling event that transformed his harsh features. "Knew him? Kid, your dad was family. He was prospecting with our chapter before the accident. He was one of us." He reached out a massive, gloved hand and gently touched the brace on Leo's leg. "Your dad was a genius with an engine, but he was an even better man. Years ago, Prez here crashed his bike out on the interstate. Bad one. He was pinned, fuel leaking everywhere. Nobody stopped. They just drove on by. But your dad did. He pulled over, used the tools in his own truck to pry the engine off Prez's leg, and dragged him clear seconds before the whole thing went up in flames. He saved his life." The story hung in the air, a revelation that recontextualized everything. The bikers weren't a random force. They were a debt being paid. "Marcus never asked for anything in return," Roadblock continued, his voice thick with emotion. "But we made a promise. We swore we'd always look out for his family. We lost track for a while after he passed. But we have long memories. One of our guys, his nephew, is a janitor here. He told us what's been going on. He told us how you carry yourself. Just like your old man, the truth was out. Leo wasn't just a boy with a broken leg. He was the son of a hero. He was the heir to a legacy of honor that these men held sacred. and they had come to honor their promise. The president turned his attention from the pale-faced Mr. Henderson to the assembled student body. His gaze swept over them, cold and appraising, finally landing on Kyle, who tried and failed to shrink into the crowd. "We understand some of you think it's fun to pick on a boy who has more honor in his little finger than your whole pathetic crew put together." The president's voice boomed, each word a hammer blow. "Let me make something perfectly clear. That stops." Today, he walked over to his motorcycle and began to unbuckle his cut. The vest was a sacred object in their world, earned with loyalty, time, and sometimes blood. It was covered in patches, each one telling a story, a roadmap of the man's life and his allegiance to the club. The other bikers watched, their expressions unreadable but conveying a deep, collective solemnity. The president walked back to Leo, the heavy leather vest in his hands. He held it out. It was a gesture of immense significance, an offering that transcended a simple piece of clothing. He then draped the enormous vest over Leo's small, trembling shoulders. It swallowed him whole, the heavy leather smelling of road dust, gasoline, and brotherhood. The winged death's head insignia on the back covered Leo's entire torso. "This family," the president declared, his voice ringing with conviction, his hand resting on Leo's shoulder, "does not stand for bullies. This boy is the son of a man who saved my life. He is the son of a man who embodied our code of honor better than most who wear this patch. That makes him family. From this day forward, Leo is under the protection of the Hell's Angels." Is there anyone here who doesn't understand that? The question was rhetorical. The silence was absolute, filled only with the sound of the wind rustling the leaves on the trees. Kyle looked at the ground, his face a mask of pure terror. His reign was over. He had built his kingdom on the fear of teenagers. He now faced an empire built on something far more primal and unyielding. The community of the school, the students and teachers who had been bystanders for so long, were now forced into a new role. They were witnesses. They were seeing the direct and terrifying consequences of their collective inaction. Mr. Henderson looked at the small boy enveloped in the president's vest, and for the first time, he saw the true measure of the child they had all failed. The recognition was dawning not just on him, but on everyone. Leo's quiet dignity was not a symptom of weakness. It was evidence of a profound, inherited strength they couldn't comprehend. Roadblock stood up and put a hand on Leo's other shoulder. "Your dad would be so proud of you, kid. The way you stood up for that little guy today." That was pure Marcus. The bikers, as one, started their engines. The sudden, deafening roar was not a threat. It was a salute, a thunderous, 80-engine chorus of respect and recognition. It was the sound of a promise kept. It was the sound of justice arriving, not in a police car or from a principal's office, but on a wave of chrome and leather, delivered by men who understood that some debts can only be paid with unwavering loyalty. The ground vibrated, and the school windows rattled. The community of Northwood High was being shown a new kind of honor, one that didn't tolerate the abuse of the vulnerable, and they stood in stunned, silent reverence. The days that followed were defined by a new, unspoken set of rules. The bikers did not vanish. Their arrival had not been a one-time dramatic statement. It was the beginning of a new reality. Every morning, 2 or 3 motorcycles would be parked near the school entrance, their riders leaning against them, sipping coffee from thermoses, their presence a silent, constant reminder. They never spoke to anyone. They never had to. Their mere existence was enough to change the entire atmosphere of the school. In the afternoons, a small escort of bikes would rumble to life as Leo emerged, falling into formation around him as he walked the few blocks to his home. The bullies, Kyle and his friends, became ghosts. They were suddenly invisible, their swagger gone, replaced by a nervous, hunted look. They walked with their heads down, avoiding eye contact, taking convoluted routes to class to avoid passing Leo in the hallway. The other students gave Leo a wide berth, but it was no longer born of a desire to avoid association with a victim. It was a new kind of space, one born of awe and a healthy dose of fear. He was no longer Leo the broken toy, he was Leo, the boy with the guardians at the gate. The oversized vest was returned to the president the next day, but a week later, Roadblock presented Leo with a package. Inside was a brand new, custom-made denim vest, child-sized. It was stark and clean, with only a single, small patch sewn perfectly in the center of the back. A detailed embroidery of a wrench and a spark plug crossed. It was a tribute to his father, the mechanic. It was a symbol of his own unique place within their world. He wore it to school the next day. The quiet statement was more powerful than any slogan. It said he belonged. It said he was protected. It said he was proud of who he was and where he came from. The transformation extended beyond the school gates. One evening, Leo's mother, Elena, was finishing her shift at the diner. She was exhausted, her feet aching, her mind preoccupied with bills. The president and Roadblock walked in. The few late-night customers froze. But the bikers only had eyes for Elena. They sat at her counter, ordered coffee, and left a $500 tip on the counter. Marcus was a good man, the president said simply. He wouldn't want his family to struggle from that day on. Elena's tip jar was never empty. Bikers would filter in and out of the diner at all hours, always polite, always respectful, and always leaving behind folded bills. Her financial burdens began to lift, and for the first time in years, the lines of exhaustion around her eyes began to soften. The final image of the transformation was quiet but profound. It was a Friday afternoon. Leo walked out of school, his small denim vest on, his backpack secure. The two bikers on duty that day nodded to him. He nodded back, a comfortable, familiar exchange. As he started his walk home, he didn't limp with the same pained hesitation. His steps were more confident, his head held high. He wasn't just walking, he was moving with purpose. He was no longer a boy defined by his brace, but a young man defined by his character. The motorcycles roared to life behind him, their engines a familiar, comforting sound, the anthem of his newfound belonging. They followed at a respectful distance, a shadow of protection that promised he would never, ever walk alone again. The community had been transformed, the bullies silenced, and respect, hard-won and dearly paid for, was finally secure.